Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Colonel Harry G. Summers, who has had a distinguished career as a soldier, a military strategist, and now a military commentator. He's the author of the widely acclaimed On Strategy, a critical analysis of the conduct of the Vietnam War, and he's at the Berkeley campus this month as the Nimitz Lecturer in Military Affairs. Joining us in the interview is Professor Tom Barnes from the History Department. Colonel Summers, welcome to Berkeley. Tell us a little about what you think it takes to be a strategic thinker. When
I was at the War College, they had a program, they were going to develop strategists. And I said to the Commandant, I'm not so sure you can do that. I think what you can do is identify potential strategists and then work to increase their knowledge. And the overarching requirement is intellectual curiosity. If you have intellectual curiosity, if you keep asking why does this happen, why does this work, I think then you have at least the potential to develop into a strategic thinker. But absent that spark, absent that desire, it's almost impossible. I mean, you can make second-rate copies, but I don't think you can ever make a strategic thinker of someone who doesn't have this sort of innate intellectual curiosity about the way the world works and the way things happen.
And is a strategic thinker in the military pretty comparable to one in who does political strategy or who does business strategy in the corporate world, or are there distinctions?
Yeah. Well, I think in my view it is. There are other people who would go to the mechanistic route and say, well, a strategy is just the use of resources to achieve ends, and therefore you can do it in almost a computerized model. That doesn't fit my idea of what a strategist is. I think it needs to be much more conceptual, much more and not so much materialistically driven. And so in that sense, I think that a military strategist is quite analogous to a strategist in the civilian side of the operation.
And how if somebody out there in our audience was interested in thinking about doing that, how do you maintain, support this intellectual spark that you start with, do you think? I mean, are there certain classic texts that one needs
I think going back to the intellectual curiosity, I think that you would have to be a military strategist, would have to be very well versed in military history, be interested, be fascinated with that sort of thing, and have a very good background on military history in general, just sort of an eclectic view of military history. That is, not only the great leaders, but battles and the histories of the general histories as well, to get a foundation to which to analyze these sort of things. I think that kind of a foundation is essential. Certainly a deep grounding in military history for a military historian. I would think for a business or a military strategist, for a business strategist, I think the same thing. You would have to be fairly well grounded in the business community or in management or whatever.
When you're talking about military strategy, what are the basic components that you have to actually have a strategy?
Well, first, it's ends and means, and I think you have to study both ends of that equation. That is, you have to be familiar in that sense then with political science and the political ends, because again, all military operations have political objectives. There are no such thing as a military objective, only political objectives. So you have to understand that side of it. You have to understand the dynamics of international politics and local politics, since, as has been said, almost all politics are local politics. And then you have to understand the military means. You have to understand the dynamics of military force, how it can be used, what its components are. And then, in addition, for an American military strategist, understand the social milieu in which it operates, because we're a very peculiar country, that the American military very much is a instrument of the American people rather than the American government. So you have to understand that dimension of it as well.
And has it been a failure in our recent history that our politicians have not understood the context in which we can have an effective military strategy?
Well, you know, as General Fred Wyand, who's a Berkeley graduate, 39, has said in a piece he wrote after the Vietnam War, anti-militarism is a constant in the American society. That's what we are. We are not so much anti-military, but anti-militarism people. So that the study of military history and military affairs is not very deeply rooted in this country. I mean, it's something we just tend to avoid. So that I think our political leaders, by and way, really don't understand the dynamics of American military power, and particularly the peculiarities of American military power. The idea that it really is a people's military and that it cannot be committed over time without the support of the American people. And I see that failing in the national political leadership. They don't understand that enormous limitation on the use of military power.
So to restate what you're saying, in other words, in our history and our traditions are a critical stance toward the military, basically, which requires politicians actually, assuming they have a goal, because that's another issue that we may get into. Sometimes maybe our political leaders don't have the goals which we need to provide the military. But in other words, that they have to be sensitive to this history and tradition of sort of being skeptical of military ways of doing things. And I guess our founding fathers actually always sort of believed in citizens' armies. I mean, it's implicit in their design for our government.
Yeah, not only exactly implicit, and explicit as well. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution makes it very clear that the American people is a creature of, or the American military is a creature of the Congress, not of the executive. And the Congress has absolute power over its very existence. So that whether we like it or not, as Clausewitz laid out in the early 19th century, when he differentiated between 18th century war, which were a matter for kings and presidents and princes, and the people were just observers, that 19th century war was a matter of what he called the remarkable trinity of the people, the government, and the army. And that observation, a very profound observation that he drew out of the French Revolution, had been drawn almost 50 years earlier in the American Revolution and incorporated into our Constitution. So that we are a Trinitarian military in the true sense of the word. And again, that has enormous ramifications for the commitment of U.S. military power and for U.S. military policy.
You are the author of a highly acclaimed book on Vietnam, and you bring these Clausewitzian insights to an examination, a critical examination of the conduct of that war. And so, following on what you just said, in the first instance, our goals in Vietnam were very unclear, so that the political side of the Trinity that you've just described was not satisfactorily dealt with by the political. Could you expound on that?
Yeah. So when we look at the objectives of the Vietnam War, we find one, Hugh Arnold at the University of Nebraska found 22 separate objectives for why we were in Vietnam, several of which were mutually exclusive, so that there was never any clear-cut political goal to be attained. So, and because there was no political goal, then the military strategies and policies built on that foundation, as someone said, it was a great logical edifice built on a foundation of gas, because there was just nothing there. So that the great tragedy of the Vietnam War was all of this military effort, the great bravery and sacrifice and everything else, was totally unfocused because of the lack of a goal, and because it was unfocused, it failed to achieve the objectives of the United States foreign policy.
Now somebody who would argue with you defending what the political leaders were doing might say, well, but the problem was that the strategic issues were so great, that there was concern about the war escalating into a nuclear war. There was concern about the intervention in China and so on. So that the political leaders were not incompetent, they were just immobilized by the complexity of the situation that they were dealing with. How would you answer that?
Well, I would think first, if that was true as we began our military involvement in the early 1965, then if those limitations were that gross, then maybe we ought not to get involved in the first place. If it was by definition unattainable and unwinnable, then it was immoral to commit forces to try to achieve something that they knew in advance was, I mean, that's sort of McNamara's argument. He knew in 1965, he says, that the war was militarily unwinnable. Yet he went ahead and committed what turned out to be 500,000 American troops, 2 million, as a matter of fact, over time, to a war which he knew was militarily unwinnable. So I think that's basically immoral. But again, I am not convinced that the war was militarily unwinnable. I think that there were strategies that had the potential, at least, of being able to succeed. But again, we were blinded by a great many things, by our false reading of the outcome of the Korean War, among other things. Mm-hmm. And we saw that as a defeat, so that model was not available to be used in Vietnam.
And explain what you mean there. I mean, what was the perception of Korea that influenced the Vietnam?
Korea came on the heels of World War II. The paradigm for war in the American minds had become a World War II paradigm. As total victory, absolute victory, unconditional surrender of the enemy, occupation of his territory, capture of his capital, hanging the enemy leadership as war criminals. And that was sort of what war should be. And MacArthur carries that vision forward, you know, total victory, the total defeat. But yet, as Dave Palmer has pointed out, you have to go back to the Punic Wars to find another example. Most wars in history have been limited wars, limited by their objectives. And it was interesting, during the great debate on the Korean War, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley, was asked, what are our objectives in Korea? And he said, you're asking the wrong person. You need to ask the Secretary of State. So they bring Dean Acheson in and ask him, and he said, well, originally our objective was the restoration of the status quo ante bellum. And then with the collapse of the North Korean army after the Incheon invasion, we changed our objective to the unification of Korea under South Korean control. And then with the Chinese intervention in November 1950, we reverted to the original objective of the status quo ante bellum. So there was a very clear-cut statement of U.S. national objectives and what needed to be obtained. And in the course of events, we obtained those objectives. That is, we obtained South Korea independent of North Korean control, and which has existed now for almost 50, or almost a half century. So that by any reasonable definition, MacArthur's call, you know, the only object of war is victory, we achieved a victory in Korea. But because it didn't match the sort of apocalyptic view of victory that came out of World War II, we didn't recognize that we'd won a victory there. Therefore, to suggest, as the Joint Chiefs suggested, as Ambassador Bunker suggested, as the South Vietnamese suggested, that a Korean War-type solution was probably applicable to Vietnam, it was just unthinkable. So essentially being to isolate the South from the North and to hold and turn the internal affairs of South Vietnam over to the South Vietnamese, who ultimately were the only ones that could solve those kind of problems. But it was recommended that we extend the DMZ across Laos into Thailand, both by the Joint Chiefs, General Westmoreland, the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, and Ambassador Bunker. But it fell on deaf ears in Washington because that model was just unacceptable.
And you argue in the book, I believe, that North Vietnam had a very different vision of the war, basically, and what they saw as the perimeters of the game,
exactly.
so to speak.
So we saw it as a limited war, and one of the anomalies that came out of the Korean War is that after the Chinese intervention, we reverted from the strategic offensive, whose goal was to defeat the enemy armed forces and occupy their territory, to the strategic defensive, which made sense, except that we didn't understand that under the strategic defensive, battlefield victory was not attainable. The best possible outcome under the strategic defensive was stalemate. And that's exactly what happened in Korea, and the war was stalemated. And then the armistice was achieved through political rather than military negotiation. Well, we went into Vietnam with the same model. Not only did we not go on the offensive, we forbid the South Vietnamese to go on the offensive. They couldn't carry the war to the north. So we took away their goal of unification. I mean, and originally President Diem had as good nationalist credentials as Ho Chi Minh did, but we denied him those credentials because it wasn't in our interest for the South Vietnamese to go north to try to attack North Vietnam, because we were fighting a war in the strategic defensive, and again, with the best possible outcome was stalemate, and of course that's exactly what was finally achieved. But because we didn't understand that fundamental limitation, therefore we didn't understand the limits of military power.
And I hear you saying that in a way that there is a logic to the conduct of war, that at a certain point you cross a threshold and you incapacitate yourself, basically, if you aren't sort of playing that game, so to speak.
Well, exactly. You know, we were caught up in this business of counterinsurgency, winning hearts and minds, the whole business of a social revolution rather than a war. North Vietnam was playing by the old rules. They were playing. They saw it as the Second Indochina War, so that Laos and Cambodia, for example, were part and parcel of the war. Their objectives were always fixed: the unification of the South. They understood from the very beginning what was involved, and were willing to pay the price in lives which were astronomical. It's somewhat the equivalent of 17 million Americans killed on the battlefield. I mean, losses that we never even begin to tolerate. They were willing to pay that kind of price in terms of casualties and in terms of time. They were willing to stay the course because, of course, their survival was at stake. The United States, Vietnam was always on the periphery. I mean, we sometimes tend to forget that for a great part of the war, it was just sort of a backburner affair that no one was very interested in. So we had a lack of parallel objectives and of parallel operations. So in a sense, the North Vietnamese, and one of the thrusts of my book is the North Vietnamese beat us at our own game. That is, they were masters of the art of war, and there was nothing inscrutable or oriental or mysterious about it. It was unfortunately laid out by Clausewitz 150 years earlier. That's what I found so disconcerting. Right?
You are also suggesting that in a way our political leaders put us in a catch-22, that the struggle in Vietnam was all important. It was so important that we could do nothing, basically, that we were essentially immobilized by all the constraints created by how important we saw the conflict.
Well, the problem is, when it was attainable, when it was winnable, the war was not important. It was a backburner affair. It was done as sort of as a, I mean, if you read How Much Is Enough, Enhoven and Smith's book about the McNamara era in the Pentagon, there's only about 20 pages of a 200-page book devoted to Vietnam. The rest of it is the Skybolt missile and nuclear strategy and a war in Europe. And you can make the case that that was probably correct. That is, Vietnam was never a threat to our national interests or to our survival, unlike the Soviet Union, which had the capacity to destroy us within minutes. So you could argue that properly the Defense Department's main attention was on the Soviet Union. And Vietnam was a backburner affair. So that while it was winnable, we paid it no heed. But then suddenly when it became unwinnable, after the American people's support was lost, then any attempt to win it was just a futile operation. The critical period was the fall of 1967, before Tet, when American public opinion for the first time shifted against the war. And again, given the Trinitarian nature of the American military, once we lost public support, it was just, and the end was inevitable.
You, as a student of democracy, one has to bring out the description in your book of the absolute failure of our political leaders to bring the public on board from the beginning, and it follows from your argument that there are three pillars to a successful military strategy. Tell us a little about that. Why do you think they did that? Well,
I think, again, I just had a letter from, as the editor of Vietnam Magazine, some young man had written his high school thesis on the Vietnam War, and one of the statements is, the American people were opposed to the war from the very beginning. And I said, well, no, not really true. It would have been easier if they were. I mean, that would have probably changed the entire outcome of the war. But the fact of the matter is, President Johnson had the overwhelming support of the American people for 30 months, the same period from the landing in North Africa in World War II until VE Day. So if you make the point, the American people supported the war in Vietnam as long as they supported the ground war in Europe, you get a little bit different flavor on it. So that the idea, well, we should have cut and run, that was never an option for LBJ, because the American people, they wanted the war won. And when they turned against the war in the fall of 1967, it wasn't the anti-war movement, it was the pragmatic side of the American character that said either win the damn thing or get the hell out. They'd lost their patience with it. It was dragging on interminably, and as it turned out, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had no concept of victory and no plan to end the war. So I think President Johnson was very poorly served by both his political advisors, that is McNamara's and the Cliffords, as well as his military advisors, because his admonition to him constantly was win the war. And he was subverted, if you will, either by incompetence or by design, by both his senior military leadership and by the senior political leadership. But so that political basis, we had the political base for victory and let it erode. We let it get away from us.
Johnson was also concerned about sacrificing his Great Society program, his domestic agenda. Is that would?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And of course he was, and I think initially at least he didn't realize the stakes involved in the Vietnam War, that it could cost him not only his presidency but the Great Society. I don't think that by the time that realization came home, it was too late. It was too late to do anything about it. So again, that great line from the Duke of Wellington in the beginning of the 19th century, where he says, "Great nations don't fight small wars." which he didn't mean that great nations didn't fight wars that were small. He meant that once a great nation gets involved in a war, the very prestige and maybe even survival of the great nations is at stake. And I don't think that realization sunk in until it was too late to do anything about it.
It occurred to me, I've been interested in reading Bui Tin's memoirs. He was a North Vietnamese colonel.
Exactly, yeah.
I think you may have met him at one time or another. He says this after Tet, and I think this is something that I'd like your comment on. Nor did we learn from the military failures of the Tet Offensive, 1968. Instead, although we had lost the element of surprise, we went on to mount further major attacks in May and September 68 and suffered even heavier losses. This too has continued to be a subject of controversy in Hanoi. Our side also suffered seriously from the subsequent pacification plans dreamed up by the Americans, such as Operation Phoenix and the Chiu Hoi campaign, which was designed to induce our troops and supporters to defect. Yet it has to be acknowledged that in the North, although we were constantly counterattacked and suffered heavy destruction for over 5 million tons of bombs, we still stood surprisingly firm in contending with the bombers of the Rolling Thunder operations. Particularly interested in your comment on the sense that we hadn't learned our lessons. Again, Vietnam often is, what are the lessons of Vietnam? Your lesson on strategy, I think, probably is the most correct of all. Well, I'm not so sure about others.
I guess the overwhelming lesson, which is not of particular value, is never get involved in a civil war in a former French colony in Indochina.
That's pretty precise.
Exactly. But if I don't see what the utility of that particular lesson is, but it's certainly true. I think we did not understand, because we lacked objectives, we had no accurate measurement. And when Morley Safer, who was certainly not a pro-military guy, goes back to Vietnam and interviews the former heads of the National Liberation Front and finds they're even more disgruntled than the Americans are. That
right.
They've been sold out by the North, they've been had, they've been deceived all the way along. And one of the comments is that the Phoenix program had been the most destructive program that we ever mounted. Yet in this country it was seen as an assassination thing, generally denigrated by the government and everything else. I think the American public has learned. America has learned the lessons of the Vietnam War fairly well. I think, though, that we've created some dangerous misunderstandings abroad. In the beginning of the Gulf War, as a Chinese diplomat said, "Well, we knew the Americans had a great deal of military might, but they're paper tiger. They don't have the will to use it." Well, and the comments made, "Well, we can't stand casualties." Baloney, baloney. If the American people are convinced of the worth of what we're doing, they'll expend, as we did in World War II, 1 million casualties in pursuit of it. There is nothing wrong with the backbone of the American character, and people very dangerously may misjudge the reaction of the other. And as I think Saddam Hussein twice has misjudged President Clinton to think that they can push him around in the Gulf. President Clinton's not going to be pushed. And for one thing, he doesn't have the political capital to allow himself to be pushed, as maybe President Bush would have had. So again, I think the world needs to learn the lessons of Vietnam as well as the American people do.
You're critical also of the academic advisors that came to the Kennedy and Johnson administration and their concepts of limited war. Why is that? Well,
we start out at the end of World War II, the greatest conventional victory in the history of warfare in World War II. But almost immediately, the atomic theorists start coming to the fore. The idea that the atomic bomb had changed everything, that wars were no longer winnable in a traditional sense, that conventional forces had no meaning, that the whole nature of war changed with atomic weapons, and only they had the sort of so-called wizards of Armageddon had the answers, and for the right price they'd let us in on a secret. What one Air Force secretary said, the tree full of owls type of civilian atomic theorists, you know. So anyway, that almost destroyed the Army and the Marine Corps. The Air Force became dominated by SAC and nuclear warfare. Korean War was seen as an aberration, and the Air Force Secretary Thomas Finletter says that. I mean, the future of the world was going to be atomic war and total war. So the Army lost among other things, lost its raison d'etre and lost its soul to some degree. Maxwell Taylor being a case in point, and we'll come back to that. So when Kennedy comes in, it becomes obvious that the theory of maximum, what do you call it?
Deterrence.
Maximum deterrence, yeah. Was not working because it gave you either the choice of nuclear war or surrender, and that really wasn't very usable in a nuclear war. So massive deterrence had failed. So when Kennedy comes in with this business of flexible response, then Khrushchev counters the American nuclear buildup, which of course he'd been forced to back down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, with wars of national liberation. If he can't get at us at the upper end of the spectrum, he's going to get at us at the lower end. And Kennedy bought it hook, line, and sinker. Not only Kennedy, but I think a great many academic thinkers as well, and military people like Maxwell Taylor, among others, bought into this theory. And so that we became convinced that counterinsurgency was the way of the future. So Kennedy puts out the word to the military, if you want to get promoted, if you want to get ahead, you better get on board. And he fired the Army Chief of Staff who didn't go along with it, George Decker. And Maxwell Taylor, of course, had been brought in from retirement to be a sort of military guru, was very much in charge of it. So again, conventional war was not, had been denigrated not only by nuclear weapons, but also by counterinsurgency. So again, the military had sort of lost its soul in this struggle, and this military thinking really had degenerated to the point that we lost the old verities.
In your writing, you emphasize the importance of the people's support of the war. As we look out into the world we're finding ourselves in a very different world with the end of the Cold War, what are the implications of that for developing a U.S. strategy for involvement in the world disorder that we find?
One of the things I found rather strange, almost an anomaly, is that if you look at military policy today in two dimensions, warfighting and peacekeeping, that President Clinton has been a rather strong president in the warfighting side of the equation. That is, in the areas of vital interest to the United States, Western Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Middle East, he has made very strong statements in support of those interests, and more to the point, has put his money where his mouth is. That is, when he took office, NATO was in free fall, and he put a 100,000-man floor under NATO and guaranteed the U.S. position in NATO. In the Middle East, in the Far East, he, unlike President Carter, who was going to withdraw U.S. forces from Korea, President Clinton addresses the Korean National Assembly, makes the point to the Korean National Assembly that Korea is a vital interest of the United States, which by definition is an interest we'll go to war over, and also puts a 100,000-man floor under forces in the Western Pacific. And then twice in his administration in the Middle East, he's committed forces forward to check Saddam Hussein's threats against Kuwait, so that as a warfighter, he doesn't get much credit for it, but as a warfighter, he's been a very strong president. But the other side of the equation, the one he campaigned on, the one he said was going to be the cornerstone of his foreign and military policy, peacekeeping, has been somewhat of a disaster. And one of the reasons why, go back a second, one of the reasons why the warfighting side has been so well done is that the American people, by and large, support it unanimously. There's no great argument over U.S. forces in Korea or in Europe or the Middle East. And because the American people support it, the Congress supports it, so that it's been adequately funded. On the peacekeeping, on the other hand, he says that in his campaign that he was going to be the world of the United States, not in so many words, but was going to be the world's peacekeeper. They were going to use U.S. forces under UN control and under UN auspices to sort of keep the peace in this uncertain world, in the post-Cold War world. And he floats the Presidential Decision Directive 13 to that effect, which sunk like a bomb. It was attacked by the American people tooth and nail, who said they didn't want their sons and daughters serving under foreigners, and attacked by the Congress, and it was abandoned. And he comes up with PDD 25, which is the current defense directive for military strategy, which ironically is a reiteration of the Weinberger Doctrine of 1984, almost word for word, where again he backs away from his campaign pledges. Not completely, he still says we're going to try to maintain peacekeeping forces, but it has not been very adequately sold to the American people, and they still don't support it. And as a result, the Congress doesn't support it and doesn't fund it. So we've got this sort of anomaly as we look to the future. That is, in the warfighting side, to the national interests, we're in fairly good shape. On the peacekeeping side, we're not, and there's somewhat public disarray in that area.
Now, are you suggesting that on the peacekeeping side, what is the problem? That the president is muddled about what he wants to do, or that he knows what he wants to do and he just hasn't educated the American people?
Secretary of Defense Perry made a speech in November 1994, which I thought was the most clearest exposition of U.S. military policy I had seen. And he starts off by saying, make no mistake about it, there are areas in this world we'll go to war for. And don't anybody forget that fact that, and again, as the bottom-up review in the Defense Department had said, that Northeast Asia, Western Europe, and Middle East are vital interests. And then he says that, but there are other areas in the world that are important but not vital. And ironically, he uses at the time Bosnia as the case in point. He said to achieve our objectives in Bosnia would require the expenditure of so much blood and treasure as to be disproportionate to the national interests of the United States. Therefore, we're not going to get involved in Bosnia. Of course, as Clausewitz tells us, military affairs are dependent on the course and changing circumstances in the course of events. But he makes a and he says that each case has to be judged on its own merit and justified on its own merit. And he used the case of Rwanda as a case of, well, a place where we went into and were able to do some humanitarian assistance, and talks about Haiti, interestingly, and does not go into humanitarian concerns at all. He justifies the Haiti intervention purely on vital interests of the United States and refugee flow. So a very hard-headed analysis. He then turns to what had been the cornerstone of the Clinton defense policy, humanitarian assistance, and he boldly states, that's not our business. Humanitarian assistance is not the business of the Defense Department. There are other agencies in the government that's responsible for it. We can help, but it's not our business. And the clinching line was, we field an army, not a Salvation Army. Well, it's pretty boldly stated. But of course, then the situation changed to the point where we have become involved in Bosnia. But it was interesting, General Colin Powell, during the bottom-up review, stopped in the middle of his press conference and said, I want to give you a little tutorial on what the Armed Forces of the United States are all about. The Armed Forces of the United States are all about fighting and winning the nation's wars. So we can do other things. We can do humanitarian assistance. We can do disaster relief and all the rest, but never at the expense of our primary mission. And of course, he got a great deal of flack on that from an awful lot of people who are in favor of peacekeeping operations. But interestingly, in January of this year, General Saakashvili in Haiti, commending the success of the Haitian intervention force, said, we need to remember that the primary mission of the Armed Forces of the United States is to fight and win on the battlefield, and we ought not to get in the habit of this sort of thing. So again, I don't think the position of the uniformed military has changed on the primacy of warfighting, but again, the Bosnian thing, the president decided we were going to go in, and the time for arguing over it was over, and the time for execution was at hand. And interestingly, the military, as it went into this operation, did their damnedest to separate military and civil tasks so that we weren't caught up in the kind of nation building that we got involved in Vietnam, for example, and we also ventured into in Somalia. It was to try to get a very clear cut to differentiate between military and civil tasks. But as General Saakashvili again said, you can separate the military from the civil, but you can never separate the military from the political. And as we see now, the political pressure to do something about war crimes, about all the major newspapers and everything else, is forcing the president to push the military across that line into civil operations and into a kind of mission creep, which they had said vehemently that they weren't going to do. But again, these pressures become such, again, back to the political nature of the armed forces, they become almost impossible to resist.
Isn't there a little bit of danger with the appointment of General McCaffrey, for instance, as drug czar, that there's already been some use of American military force for drug interdiction? We know there are suggestions to use the United States Army as a form of border patrol, or even border barrier. When is this going to stop? I mean, how far can we reasonably expect? Is there some danger, first of all, that Major General McCaffrey's, perhaps General McCaffrey's appointment will give greater credibility to just that kind of change?
Several years ago, there was an article written by an Air Force Colonel, Charles Dunlap, called The Coming Military Coup of 2012. And it was an award-winning essay, award-winning by the Joint Chief. And essentially his thrust was that in the intervening years, the military had become more and more involved in civil tasks. Posse comitatus had gone by the wayside. We had the military involved in law enforcement and drug enforcement and all the rest, to the point where the military thought, well, they could do it better than the civilians could. So we end up with a military coup overthrowing the government. And it was a cautionary tale of the dangers of involving the military in civil tasks. I mean, Sam Huntington, the original Nimitz lecturer, in his book had said there's two ways of dealing with the military. Objectively, you keep them doing military tasks and keep them in their barracks, and that's the way to control them. But if subjectively, if you allow them to take over civilian tasks, pretty soon they think that they are the civilians, and you endanger the basis of the government. So that, again, I don't see any great danger of a military coup in this country, but there is a danger of involving the military in non-military tasks, even beyond the business of the coup, and we see the example to our north.
Yeah.
A Canadian author, Colonel Jack English, wrote a book on the Normandy campaign, and he pointed out after World War I, the Canadian military, in what he called a corruption of power, in their desire to be loved, got more and more involved in civilian tasks to the point where they lost their military skills. And then when he went into the battlefield in Normandy, they got their soldiers killed by the tens of thousands because they were militarily incompetent. So in that same period, interestingly, as Fehrenbach pointed out in his great book, This Kind of War, the American military in the interwar years retreated unto itself, become rather bitter and sort of under siege. But we have someone like Eisenhower, for example, as a lieutenant colonel, being forced to read Clausewitz 3 times by Fox Connor before he'd even talk about it. So that the American military concentrated on their military skills, and that paid off when in the beginning of World War II we could take these obscure majors and lieutenant colonels and make them generals in command of our armed forces. So there's a great danger in the, and Barry McCaffrey's a case in point. McCaffrey's one of my students, as a matter of fact, at the War College, an outstanding officer. But if you give him a job, he'll do it. And that's part of the danger. Ironically, it doesn't sound.
He's too good.
He's too good, yeah. And so that I think it's, and I am afraid that he may become the latter-day Max Taylor. As John Kennedy brought in Max Taylor as his personal military advisor and sort of short-circuited the Joint Chiefs. And one of the damning comments on the Joint Chiefs of the Vietnam War was by a member, General Bruce Palmer, who said essentially that the civilians were running it, and the JCS sat on their hands and said, screw them, let them run it. So even though they knew the strategy was faulted, even though they knew we had no policy worthy of the name, they said nothing and let the country go down the tube. A damning indictment of the Joint Chiefs during the Vietnam War period.
Strangely, you're being a military man, but what I hear you as having is a very healthy respect for democracy.
Oh, exactly so.
And that in many ways our politicians are failing because they, for reasons that aren't clear, are comfortable in turning to the military to undertake tasks that are terribly difficult, but in fact the military really isn't competent to handle them satisfactorily, and it was never intended to do so.
There's an article in Parameters, which is the journal of the Army War College, by a young major who says that the task of the military is due to the dirty deeds for the country. That is, to do the things like drug enforcement and law enforcement, etc. A very, very dangerous idea, it seems to me. And he didn't understand the fundamental nature of the American military. The military needs to be kept in its barracks, as Sonington said so very well, because of the fact it can do the job. I mean, it has the organization, and that's one of the attractions to civilians. It has the organization and the structure and the discipline to do a task that's assigned to it.
Constantly trained, too. Constantly involved for training for war.
Yeah, and a strange case in point was this brouhaha over the Specialist New affair, this young man who refused to wear the UN uniform in Bosnia. The president, having run into a firestorm of criticism under PDD 13, when he said that we were going to put U.S. forces under UN control and all this, should have been very sensitive to this issue. And when this young kid sort of refused those orders, he should have said to the military, transfer him in another unit for Christ's sake. Let it die. Let it, don't make an issue out of it. But instead, the administration said the Army handle it. Well, it handled it.
General court-martial.
Yeah. And again, from the military point of view, there was no case. It was a legitimate order. Violation of a direct order is a particularly heinous military offense, and he was very quickly tried, found guilty, and now has become, and I think will become a source of irritant to the president during the upcoming election, because there's an awful lot of people who believe the black helicopters are now flying over the West. The UN's about to take over the country. Are going to use the New affair to beat the administration with. So they ought to have been sensitive to the fact if you tell the military to do it, they're going to do it. And sometimes that's not the wise political course of action.
Do you think these political leaders are too focused on elections too much of the time? And by that I mean that elections lead to them to build up expectation, promise things, promise solutions to problems, which in fact they find it very difficult to do anything about it when they actually take office?
I think they would argue that their basis of power rests with the American people. So therefore, they have got to be responsive to the wishes and desires of the American people. So what we would see as domestic politicking, they would argue is sort of the nature of the beast. Richard Neustadt wrote a book on alliance politics one time where he's talking about the Suez Crisis, where he says that all politics is domestic politics. There's no other kind.
No, that's right.
Because politicians get elected or defeated at home, not abroad. So that every action, international action, military action, has a domestic political edge to it. Well, some presidents handle it better than others. And I think that's probably the truth of the matter. Certainly, Franklin Roosevelt had to worry about the domestic reaction to Pearl Harbor, or the Battle of the Bulge, for that matter, when it looked like we were about to screw it up in Europe, and handled it very well. Truman certainly handled the Korean War initially very well, but then screwed it up on the Chinese intervention. And again, LBJ with his handling of the Vietnam War, again, it was because he didn't handle it very well, led to his own defeat. So again, domestic politics is part and parcel of has to be part and parcel of military policy. It has to be factored into everything, and there is no way you can separate out the two, not in a democracy. And again, it's interesting where Clausewitz goes into this 150 years ago, where he said that military counsel and the councils of wars is the most least important of all. That the political counsel, that what he calls the interaction of peoples and their government, are the governing factors in war. And the military's simple job is just to execute the policy that they come up with. And I think that's particularly true, that we don't want to involve the military in domestic politics. And part of Johnson's problem, and Kennedy's problem, is that he did that with Maxwell Taylor. When John Paul Vann came back from Vietnam to testify that things were screwed up in Vietnam, Maxwell Taylor forbid him to talk to the Joint Chiefs. And General Bruce Palmer said it was obvious that he and McNamara were playing domestic politics because the presidential election was coming up. Well, that should be intolerable. That is, as General Ridgway had said who was our leader after the Korean War, the military advisor's job is to tell the president the truth in clear and unvarnished terms, and not cut the mustard and cut the advice for any reason. And I think that's essentially what General Powell has done as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and to some degree General Saakashvili has done as well. Powell did it more flamboyantly, I think. Saakashvili has done it more quietly. But I think they've tried to give the president the best military advice, but yet once the decision is made, our system says then it's time to either resign or execute. I mean, no more quibbling about the orders once the decision is made. That's what we're seeing, I think, in Bosnia. The military's they were against it from the very beginning for a lot of reasons. They were told to do it, and they'll do it to the best of their ability.
Now, we seem to have gotten things right in the Gulf War. Is that correct?
I think so. We almost went wrong. In one of the accounts of the Gulf War, that the decision was being made of whether or not to go to the Congress to seek an approval for the war. And legal advisors were telling the president, follow the Korean War example. Fall back on your authority under Article 2 as Commander-in-Chief of the authority to commit troops, as Johnson had done and as Nixon ultimately had done. And to his great credit, Bush refused to do that.
He said no. He played basically by the War Powers Act.
By the traditional rules laid out by the Constitution, and went to the Congress for their permission. And it was a near thing. He just barely got it. But I thought at the time we're finally back on track. And one of the things, again, that Bush did, he hammered and hammered and hammered and hammered on the objectives of what we're trying to do. Eject the Iraqis from Kuwait, restore the government there, and provide for peace and security in Iraq.
The 4th of November, wasn't it? The 4th of November.
And he kept hammering and hammering and hammering on it, so that the American people basically understood it. They understood precisely what we were in the Gulf. Kind of ironically, the revisionists afterwards have gone back and said, well, you didn't seize Baghdad. And the answer is, well, we never intended to. That wasn't one of the objectives. So again, that World War II syndrome of the apocalyptic victory is coming back to haunt us, even by people like General Bernie Traynor, who ought to know better.
Yeah, he was a Nimitz lecturer here a couple of years ago, and in fact, he made that very, very clear when he was here.
Yeah, who said, you know, that the military should have done this, that, and the other. I mean, he should understand, and I'm sure he does, that the objectives are political, not military. And when the political objectives were realized in Bush's mind, the war ended as it should have.
And so interestingly, you're saying that even though some could say that there was a long-term political failure in the sense that Saddam Hussein was not overthrown, it was still a military success because there was a more limited political goal which the military successfully followed and then acted and achieved that goal.
The only legitimate measure of military success is the attainment of the political goals that they set out to achieve. I mean, anything beyond that it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
The military's job is to attain the political goals set by the administration, and they demonstrably did that in the Gulf. And part of the problem that people don't seem to understand is that we are committed to coalition warfare, and we can no longer unilaterally set the objectives of the war. One of the reasons why the objectives in the Gulf were limited is because our allies insisted on it. They didn't want the United States occupying Baghdad. They didn't want the U.S. to be the kingmaker in the Persian Gulf, and neither did the Soviet Union, who was probably our most effective ally in the conduct of the war, even though they committed no troops.
Exactly.
So again, our objectives were limited by very real political considerations. So, and again, once those political objectives were realized, the military objective was attained.
How do you evaluate the media's role in all of this, in educating the people about the military's role in our society and these other matters we've been discussing?
I address that in two parts. First, because we are a Trinitarian military, the glue that holds the Trinity together is the media. That is, at the end of the Vietnam War, the idea is we'll do away with the draft and just enlist the great unwashed, and if we get them killed, who gives a damn? I mean, the elitists who were saying that thought that because they not only didn't know anybody in the military, they didn't even know anybody who knew about anybody in the military. But the media wouldn't let that happen. And when those Marines were killed in Beirut, they suddenly had their pictures on the front pages of all the paper, and they were talking to their mommies and their daddies and their sisters and brothers. They were not nameless, faceless. And of course, the same phenomena in Somalia and in Mogadishu, and the same phenomena in the Gulf when someone is in the Gulf, not only in the Gulf but in Bosnia today. So the media serves the purpose as the glue that holds this trinity of the people, government, military together. And to that we owe them a great deal of credit and praise. Although I don't think most military people see it in that light. But the job of educating the American public, the media has not done a very good job. The current issue of the Atlantic Monthly, James Fallows has a piece on the limitations of the American media. And for one thing, they don't understand the military very well. And it's not so much anti-militarism as just sort of benign neglect. I worked for U.S. News for a while after I retired, and I didn't find any great anti-militarism there, but I found a great apathy about the military.
A lot of pure ignorance.
Yeah, and pure ignorance.
Sure, they don't know a tank from a scout car. For
exactly
instance,
so, and don't care.
And don't care.
Yeah. In fact, they take sort of a perverse pride of not being, quote, captured by the military-industrial complex.
By the way, General Traynor would agree with you on all these things with respect to the press. That was one theme that he struck here when he was here.
Well, I was on a panel for the 20th Century Fund after the Grenada invasion, and a great many witnesses came, and what was developing was an enormous gap between the military and the media. And one of the great anomalies of the Vietnam War was that the military hated the media in general and liked them in particular. That is, they liked the people they knew. When my first book came up, Dan Rather held it up on CBS News and talked about it for 3 minutes. And it was unbelievable. And I said to a friend of mine, I can't believe that the Communist Broadcasting Company would give me that kind of air. And he said, what the hell are you talking about? He said, Dan Rather was with me in the Highlands. He went on patrols with him. He thought the world rose and set in Dan Rather. So he had a view of him, of course, that I didn't share because I didn't know that. But after the war, all the war stories about the media began to take hold, and the media became the devil incarnate. As somebody in Grenada thinks, well, you've got to talk to me. I'm an American reporter. I'm from a Time reporter. I'm an American reporter. I said, you're not an American reporter. You belong to Time Inc., for Christ's sake. You're an international conglomerate. So, you know, and of course there was some truth in that when Dan Rather was criticized during the Gulf War for talking about our tanks driving forward. A lot of his colleagues in the media he says, oh, you can't say our. You've got to be sort of the imperial media in Lebanon. So there's a gulf, I think, that exists. The military has tried very hard to close that gulf. Our war colleges and staff colleges have media days, and they bring the media in and talk to the troops and this, that, and the other. But of course, on the other side of the equation, there is no media. I mean, that's just an abstraction. I mean, you've got the New York Times, the LA Times, I mean, you've got all these different, and there's no connector between the two of them. So you can't deal with the media as a block. You can only deal with them as individuals. But we have a core of reporters. Broder in the LA Times, Molly Moore in the Washington Post. You can go down the list. There is a number of people, Rick Atkinson is another one, who are very good and who know what they're talking about. But generally speaking, when a crisis occurs, suddenly you get this deluge of part-timers and all the rest who come in and, as you say, don't know the difference between an Abrams and an Apache.
One final question, Colonel Summers. As I reviewed in my mind all that you said here, it sounds to me that to really do strategy and understand strategy, one has to have an understanding of one's own country's culture, its people, its history, the functioning of its democracy. So it sounds to me that, in conclusion, you're saying that a liberal arts education is still a good place to start. Is that correct?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You know, Clausewitz, again, 150 years ago, said, to understand the relative forces that involve, you've got to take into account the character of the people, their will, their motivation, their history, their background, and their fundamentals, as well as the means of war, the tools, this, that, and the other. And he ends up by saying, even Newton himself would quail before the mathematical equations thus involved. But again, I think in the context of the Nimitz lecture, we cannot afford to have an officer corps chaired by technicians, led by technicians who understand the mechanics of war, and purely that is, the military academy graduates. And my son's a military academy graduate, and he's certainly not that limited, but I think we need the sort of liberal, educated background of an officer corps. Fred Wyant, case in point, who was the last commander in Vietnam, and the Army Chief of Staff, who was a Berkeley graduate in 1939. Those are the kind of people we need at the helm, where instead of a stab-in-the-back theory coming out of the Vietnam War, Wyant can say to the Army, well, anti-militarism is sort of a trait that makes us what we are. We ought to be proud of it. We ought to understand it.
Yeah.
And instead of being agitated by, we're not going to be loved, but at least we can be respected. That kind of a reaction coming out of his liberal arts background and education prevented the kind of disaster that overtook Germany after World War I and France after the Algerian thing. So it has enormous payoffs, and we ought not to jeopardize this liberally educated officer corps in the sake of rather narrow and parochial issues that are really no import over time.
Colonel Summers, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you, Professor Barnes, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.